Good afternoon, everybody. As I say every week at about this time, the virtual door into the Zoom webinar is a single file door. We're going to let people kind of populate in for a moment or two and probably get started at 3:33, give or take. All right, I'm going to get started with intros. It's looking like we may have lost some attendees this week too. I think a lot of people are taking a staycation or something that looks like that going into July 4th week. So let's get started, especially because I think people will keep trickling in and you didn't come to see me, you came to see the panel. So hello, and welcome to the Smart, Equitable Commonwealth, Co-Creating the Society We Want. My name is Dan O'Brien, and I'm the director of the Boston Area Research Initiative, or BARI. This is the 10th week of the conference, and we have an exciting discussion today about equity in education. Every few weeks or so, I take a moment to just sort of reflect aloud where we are, and I think this has been quite the run so far, and it's going to continue. I just want to remind everybody that we now have had 10 of these webinars, and we have 4 more to come. And we are going to take a week off for the week of July 4th. So there will be no webinar next week, but we'll be back the following week with a fantastic session on traffic in Boston. And then slate 4 will follow with 3 more panels, one on 2 Bostons and segregation in the city, another one on pollution, and then we will close with a final keynote titled, "What Do Cities and Towns Need Now?" which will be a fantastic conversation between 4 local mayors and town managers, a great moderator, and a response from Mark Drayson, Executive Director of the MAPC, who has sort of a panoramic view of what cities and towns are up against right now. So that all said, a quick reminder, the podcasts for our first 9 panels are now available through Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, Stitcher, or SoundCloud. This is also where you will find all future podcasts released each Friday. And so last Friday's came out this morning. So be sure to subscribe. So with that, I want to turn to the panel. Today's conversation, I've been really looking forward to for weeks, actually. It really connects to something that came up the first week of this conference and has come up in conferences and BARI's work for years now. How do we invest in our young people's education equitably? This is always a challenge. It is always a major point of conversation here in the Commonwealth, as highlighted by the discussion about equity funding and the legislation that was passed over the past few years. And even more now with COVID, as we think about, right, what does equity look like with remote learning and with return to school and all these other things we didn't expect. And not entirely by accident, we're actually having this conversation on what was supposed to be the last Friday of the school year. To that effect, today's moderator, Ross Wilson, is the executive director of the Shah Family Foundation, and he's really uniquely positioned to lead this conversation today. Before joining Shah, Ross spent 2 decades at BPS as everything from chief of staff to kindergarten teacher. And he has degrees in special ed, elementary ed, and educational psychology. And in fact, I had not realized Ross was a kindergarten teacher at one point, but recently he and I were talking, and I'd mentioned my own kindergartner, and he made a comment that sounded just a little too informed about developmental stages at kindergarten, and now I understand why. And so in recent years at Shaw, he has championed a handful of influential projects, most notably the My Way Cafe and a new approach to thinking about nutrition in Boston public schools. And what's so much fun about the way Shaw does their work is they have this focus on big projects that are visionary and inventive. And especially given the years of effort around equity, that seems to be the kind of perspective we need to solve problems and the challenges that face us right now. And it's also going to be perfect because I think it's the one that will keep our panelists on their toes today and forcing them to offer really impactful creative thoughts. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ross.
Dan, thank you for the kind introduction. I'm thrilled to be here today, and I also agree, Dan, that this conversation about equity in education couldn't be more timely. I mean, with the civil unrest in our country and in our city, we all have to be extremely concerned about what's happening in our educational system. And as we know, the achievement gaps in our educational system are profound, and there's no more important time to deal with these gaps than now, especially that learning has been interrupted for the past number of months, and who knows what the foreseeable future looks like. We have three amazing panelists today. We have Raina from Boston School Finder, who's going to talk to us a bit about how parents feel about choosing schools and what decisions they're making. Peter from Boston Indicators and the Boston Foundation, who's going to share with us sort of general trends that are that have been happening in Boston, Greater Boston, around segregation and school-age children in Boston. And we have Ryan, who's going to kick us off from the Boston Business Alliance for Education, who's going to start off with sort of a larger viewpoint here around funding and equity in school funding across our state. So we're going to have each of the three panelists present, and then we'll go ahead and enter into a discussion. And we encourage all of you to please enter your questions into the chat, and we look forward to a lively conversation about equity in education. So Ryan Flynn, Mass Business Alliance for Education. Ryan, we're gonna kick off with you and have you start off talking to us about expanding student opportunity in Massachusetts through equitable educational aid.
Thank you, Ross, and thank you to the BARI community for welcoming me into this discussion. I work for the Massachusetts Business Alliance for Education. We're a policy advocacy nonprofit. But this work is collaborative. My co-author is James Sutherland from the Greater Boston Chamber of Commerce, and actually received his PhD from Northeastern, so I imagine he's probably well known to many in this community, but it's my first time, so it's a pleasure to be here. In Massachusetts, access to an adequate education is guaranteed by the state constitution, and as a result, the state calculates each year how much it must spend to provide an adequate education for every student based on students' varying needs. This is called the state's foundation budget. And last year, the foundation budget for roughly 940,000 students was $11.4 billion, or $12,088 per student. The state shares the cost of the foundation budget with each of its 351 cities and towns. The state's share of the foundation budget is called Chapter 78, after the section of the law that defines how school funding works in Massachusetts. For the school year that just ended, required municipal contributions were equal to $6.5 billion, or 57% of the total state foundation budget, while Chapter 78 was $5.2 billion, or 46%. This year, because of changes to how the foundation budget is calculated, contained in the Student Opportunity Act, the landmark education funding reform bill that passed in November 2019, and increases funding, particularly for higher need students, both municipal contributions and state Chapter 78 will go up. Municipal contributions by $279 million and Chapter 78 by $304 million in the governor's proposed budget. Now, the amount that each municipality is required to contribute to its schools depends on its wealth and its income, although not exclusively, an insight that prompted us to actually write this paper. But in general, however, wealthier municipalities are required to pay a greater percentage of their school district's foundation budget. In order to determine how much each municipality is required to contribute to its schools, the state does a second calculation called the Chapter 78 calculation. This calculation wasn't changed significantly by the Student Opportunity Act, but because it determines how state aid is shared across communities based on wealth, it has a significant impact on equity. And our research examines how this Chapter 78 calculation affects the distribution of state aid across school districts. Our methodology is pretty straightforward. School district and municipal data we use are available through the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. And to examine the impact on equity of these changes, we divide districts into quintiles, using the state's measure of school district capacity to fund its school district budgets based on wealth and income, and divided by the school district's foundation budget. What that essentially does, is generate a ratio of capacity to pay over required school spending. And we use that to rank districts into 5 equal groups. To examine the impact of the Chapter 78 calculation and the factors contained in it on the distribution of aid, we extend a model created by the department and available on their website that performs the Chapter 78 calculation. We extend their base model to allow us to test the impact of altering formula values that aren't possible to alter in the base model. And we use the governor's proposed FY21 budget numbers called H2 for the analysis. We show that $778 million or 14% of total Chapter 78 is allocated to cities and towns on the basis of factors included in the Chapter 78 formula that don't take explicitly into account underlying community need. We call these need-blind formula factors. Taken together, needs-blind formula factors increase overall Chapter 78, but their effect on the distribution of aid is regressive. Almost 2/3 of the $778 million attributable to needs-blind factors go to the wealthiest 20% of school districts in the state. Removing these factors would increase the progressivity of state aid, sending a higher percentage of aid to lower wealth communities. And if the money attributable to these factors is redistributed, it would increase the funding available to lower wealth communities. These communities serve a disproportionate share of students of color, students from low-income backgrounds, and English learners. In the bit of time that remains, I want to introduce to you just a couple of these need-blind formula factors to give you a sense of what we're talking about and their effect on the distribution of Chapter 70 state aid. The first factor is called the hold harmless factor. The state guarantees that each district will receive at least as much state aid as it did the year before, regardless of changes to the number of students served and the level of student need. This guarantee is called the hold harmless provision. Chapter 70 state aid attributable to the hold harmless factor is $319 million this year in this year's proposed budget, with the wealthiest communities receiving 5 times more approximately in state aid than the lowest wealth communities. Also important to note that it's not just wealthy versus low wealth. A substantial amount of aid goes to middle quintile 3 communities as well. And as you can see, it's distributed across all quintiles to some extent. The next is minimum aid. Minimum aid provides a flat per student increase in state aid when districts would not otherwise get an increase. Generally speaking, districts that are held harmless also receive minimum aid. The proposed FY21 minimum aid rate is $30 per student in the district and accounts for $11.9 million total, with the wealthiest communities receiving over 6 times more minimum aid per student compared to the lowest resourced communities. Finally, just one more, although it's not the extent of these factors, and I'm happy to talk about others during the conversation, is the last one I'll talk about is the maximum local contribution share. And for FY21, the state calculates that 104 of Massachusetts' 351 municipalities can fully afford to fund their schools from local resources available to them. However, a municipality's contribution to schools is capped at 82.5% of its foundation budget. This assures that wealthy communities still receive some Chapter 70 state aid. If the state were to eliminate the ceiling on this maximum local contribution, effectively requiring municipalities with the means to afford their schools' entire foundation budget to do so, Chapter 70 aid would increase by $221 million statewide, with the lowest resource communities gaining $82 million, while the wealthiest communities see an aid reduction in $4 million. Just one thing to note here is that this is different than the other 2 mechanisms in that it increases Chapter 78 overall, where the other 2s reduce it. And I talk a little bit about why that's the case if folks have questions later on. But at the moment, let me just finish with a concluding thought. These are findings, and they're just that. They're not recommendations about what the state should do. The effect of changes on the Chapter 78 formula, changing these factors' effect on the Chapter 78 formula is complicated, and questions about how resources should be distributed across districts is ultimately a political one that requires consideration of many factors beyond the scope of our analysis, and perhaps we'll get into some of that. However, from a technical perspective, we do believe there's a case for over time seeking to minimize the impact of these needs-blind factors. And we also think that our findings indicate that it may be possible to find money within the state's existing funding formula, a finding that may have some utility at a moment when we've both made historic commitments to increase education funding and also face historic budget pressures. So with that, let me say thank you, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Ryan. You left us with on like kind of a cliff there with some questions that we should be asking you in the follow-up. So thank you very much for that. It's my pleasure now to turn over to Peter Surzak from Boston Indicators Project, which is a part of the Boston Foundation. But Peter, maybe you can explain that. And Peter's going to talk to us and give us an overview of kids today. So Boston's declining child population and its effect on school enrollment. This is a study that I've been a part of, seeing different presentations. It's fascinating, and we look forward to your presentation, Peter.
All right, thank you, Ross, and thank you, BARI, for hosting us. And yeah, Boston Indicators is essentially the research think tank of the Boston Foundation, and we work on a variety of different projects, including a lot of demographic research and kind of where the world is today. I'm gonna pop my share screen over so you all can take a look at my PowerPoint. So, hello, my name is Peter Turchak, as we've discussed, and I was one of the co-authors on Kids Today. One of my co-authors is actually in the audience as well, Antonia Marinova. And what we undertook to when we undertook this project, it was in an effort to understand how segregation played out across Boston's public schools, particularly in the schools. And it was a much smaller project, but as we kept doing it, we realized that in order to actually understand Boston's schools as they are today, we have to go back in time and also expand the context of the work we were looking at and of the region we were looking at. And what we found at the conclusion of this report is that Boston is actually becoming a city of childless professionals. For those students that do remain, they are more frequently of color and more frequently lower income than in many points in the past. So in order to actually give you a good idea of where we start, let's kick it off and take a look at where we were back in 1950. Back then, Boston was a large city population of around 800,000. We've seen declines since then to 1980, and then since 1980, we've seen significant increases. We're almost back at our 1950 totals, and this is for the total population. But this trend doesn't carry across all demographic groups. In fact, when we look at students and kids between the ages of 5 and 17 years old, we see that back in 1950, while we had a population of 134,000 or so kids that were between the ages of 5 and 17, we've actually seen significant declines since then. First of these came around 1970 when we saw the first years of integration, suburbanization, and various other factors, generally people leaving the city, but importantly, also people were having fewer kids. Right around when the city began to turn around population-wise, we saw an increase in 5 to 17-year-olds, followed again in 2000 by a decrease. We think has something to do with increasing cost of neighborhoods and living in the city itself. At the end of the day, while the rest of Boston's population is beginning to recover significantly, our school-age population of 5 to 17-year-olds remains just over half of what it once was. And this process is not unique to Boston. In fact, a lot of similar cities across the US have seen similar trends occur. Boston in 1970 had a school-aged population of around 21% of the total population of the city of Boston. Today, we have one that's around 11%. And as you can see, this is just one in a number of cities that have seen these declines, various trends, including again, people having fewer children. But it's not just a course in time. We also see people moving away from these cities. The next slide I'm going to show you takes a more regional look at where kids are in the city and jumps forward to around 2000. As you can see, between 2000 and 2019, Boston has lost roughly 10% of its school-aged children. Likewise, some of the first streetcar suburbs, Somerville and Medford, have lost some portions of their students, their school-aged kids as well. But as you can see, there's been some growth elsewhere. In Metro West, we've seen growth across Belmont, Sudbury, Wellesley. But we also see growth across the Mystic, in Everett, in Chelsea, and Revere. And a lot of these growth in school-age children that we see there are typically growth in Latino school-age children. A lot of foreign-born children that are coming and being served by the schools in those areas. Now, the next slide I'm going to go to takes us a little closer to home in Boston itself and gives you an overview of how our change in school-age population has declined since around 1940. As you can see, back then we educated, the Boston's public schools educated around 110,000 students. Today we educate just 65,000. Now that changes also the demographic makeup of our schools. Next slide I'm going to take a look at is one that breaks up our student body by race and ethnicity and compares 1980 to 2018. And what you can see here is back in 1980, our student body was roughly 35% white, 44% black, and a various mixture of other racial and ethnic children. And as we proceed to 2018, that changes considerably. Our white student body is roughly 13% of the overall student body. Black students make up roughly 35% of the student body. But remarkably, we've seen an increase of Latinos, Latino children making up roughly 42% of our public school population. And of course, it's not as if these students are distributed equitably across our school districts and across our school district. Next slide I'm going to show you looks at a common metric of school segregation, one that looks at whether or not students are attending schools in which they make up 90% or students of color make up 90% or more of the student body. As you can see back in 1980, this was not too much of a concern. This is right at the tail end of integration. Roughly 2% of all students of color attended schools in which they made up 90% or more of the student body. This is roughly similar to Black and Latino students as well. By 2000, that's changed considerably. 57% of Black students attended schools in which they attended schools in which 90% or more of the student body was students of color, and 52% overall. By 2019, that's changed again. 66% of students of color attend schools in which they make up 90% or more of the student body. That's even more distinct and more obvious when you look at the share of Black students and Latino students attending schools in which they attend schools more than 90% student of color. This is even more direct when you look at Black and Latino students, and Asian students are increasingly attending schools in which they make up the majority as well. And it's not just racial and ethnic demographics that have changed since 1980, of course, it's also income demographics. Next slide I'm going to show you looks at change across Boston families with children, Boston families without children, as broken up into 3 income brackets: low income, middle income, and high income. In 1980, since 1980, we've gained around 6,000 families, low-income families with children, and that speaks to kind of the success of our income-restricted housing programs here in Boston. By contrast, we've lost around 6,000 middle-income families. These are families who are able to move elsewhere and pursue schooling for their children in different districts. We've also similarly gained some high-income families with children. But it's even more distinct when you look at low-income, middle-income, and high-income families without children. Those gains are pretty substantial, suggesting there is some dimension here, and school really does play a part in whether or not people stick around to Boston. And of course, this plays out in the school districts themselves. Next slide I'm going to show you looks at a time period between 1995 and 2014 when Boston was able to tell whether a student was from a family of lower income. These are students who are attending free or reduced price meals. In 1995, roughly 82% of low-income students attended schools in which they made up 50% or more of the student body. And this is more kind of dispersed. 57% of low-income students attended schools in which they made up 60 to 79% of the student body, and just 23% low-income students attended schools where they made up 80% or more. But by 2014, this has changed considerably. 97% of low-income students in 2014, and we think we have every reason to believe that these trends have continued, attended schools in which they made up 50% or more of the student body. And moreover, these students are now attending schools in which they're making up more than 80% of the student body itself. 64% of low-income students we expect, and we found make up or attending schools in which they make up 80% or more of the school body. And overall, what that means is we found that, especially given changes in school assignment policy, our neighborhoods look like our schools. And if we want to better equip our students, better integrate our schools, we're going to have to address housing policy, not only in Boston, but regionally. We're going to have to address a number of factors that kind of prevent the kind of equity and equitable access to education that make it difficult for a lot of students here in the city. Thank you. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Peter. So you're leaving us with if we want our neighborhood, our schools are reflective of our neighborhoods, and if our neighborhoods are segregated, then we need to figure out how to deal with housing by housing, and then we need to figure out how to deal with housing policy in our city. That's an interesting perspective. Look forward to the conversation and to the chat questions for you at the end of this to talk about what's next for Boston and how do we combat this. Thank you very, very much. I'm going to turn it over to Raina Cannon from Boston School Finder. Boston School Finder is an organization that was created a few years ago to really help parents find a great school for their child in Boston. And this organization has taken off by not only being a resource for parents who are trying to find a great school for their child, but really presenting great information for families across Boston about the registration process, about how to navigate this very complex system. And I can't imagine a school system or city without a Boston School Finder in it. So I'm going to turn it over to Raina to tell us more about Boston School Finder and what she's hearing from parents about choosing a great school.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. And thank you, Ross, for that introduction. And I'm here today to talk about Boston School Finder, a tool that was developed for families to help make the school enrollment process more equitable for all of Boston's families. I'll start today with a quick overview of Boston School Finder, who we are and what we do. And then I'll discuss some of the equity issues in Boston's current enrollment system and the challenges that families face. And finally, I'll wrap up with how we've approached developing Boston School Finder with an equity lens, with an eye towards supporting all of Boston's families. All right, Boston School Finder is a web tool that was launched in the fall of 2017, and the goal was really simple: give all of Boston's families a single location to learn about all of Boston's school options. Our tool centralizes over 200 school profiles. It focuses on K through 12 specifically across a variety of school sectors: district schools, public Commonwealth charters, and private options on a single site. And these profiles are translated into 7 languages besides English. Excuse the motorcycle noises behind me. When we launched the site, we didn't really know what to expect. That first year, however, we reached over 6,000 users, and today over 32,000 total users have leveraged Boston School Finder in its 3 years of existence. And so what does a web tool have to do with school equity? Well, it turns out that our enrollment system in Boston has a lot of features that make it and the outcomes around it very inequitable for families. And this is where we've tried to make some of these processes more equitable for our families. Before I tell you a little bit more about how we do that, I wanted to give you a sense of the school landscape. Boston has a lot of different types of schools available to families, over 200 total district, public, charter, private schools within the city borders. We also have programs like METCO and School Choice, which are partnerships with school districts outside of Boston, which Boston students are attending school as part of. And now that in itself is not an issue, but the way that these choices are presented to families and the systems that they leverage to enroll students give many families challenges while privileging others, which leads to these inequities. For example, say that you're a family with a 3-year-old child and who will turn 4 by September 1 this year. Your child was eligible for free public pre-K or very low cost pre-K in many of Boston's schools. However, those schools are spread across a variety of school types. None of them talk to each other. And so as a parent, you would need to first know that Boston has this option available to all families. You need to do some research, decide on which school types to enroll in. Keep in mind that you don't enroll in a school, you enroll in a lottery or application. You figure out which schools have the option that you need for that grade. You keep track of a variety of deadlines and application processes. Just to throw another loop in there, all the application processes are different. They're not centralized. You have to not miss deadlines, which are often 6 to 9 months before school begins for a child, and then hope that you get a seat. And if you don't, you try again for kindergarten. And then this process will repeat at multiple points in your child's life, as Boston has several transition points for schools that are not consistent within or across schools or school types. In fact, BPS alone has, I think, over 25 or 30 school grade configurations across its 125 schools, which is just a lot. And so even families who have a lot of time and social capital can find this process challenging. But imagine if you're a family that's new to Boston and not familiar with the school system. Perhaps you don't speak English at home, or you have a child that has a specific learning need, or you have a job or jobs that they don't afford you the flexibility to go and register for school in person during regular business hours without giving up income. So the act of trying to sift through school options and the registration process can get very overwhelming very quickly. Deadlines can get missed, and these things have huge ramifications. I know we have several parents on this call. I'm a parent myself. I went through this process a couple of years ago, and I've helped a lot of families through this process, and it can be very overwhelming. Quick overview. I compiled some research findings. Obviously, other folks on this call can give you a little bit more detail, but it's about 75,000 school-age children in Boston. 77% of the public school students are low income, 87% are students of color, and a third that attend BPS are limited English proficient. And so you put these numbers and processes for enrolling in school together, and you start seeing very quickly why our current process does not work well for families and creates these lasting inequities and long-term ramifications for students. Things like access to challenging curriculum, entry into different quality schools, high school graduation rate, health disparities down the line. All of these things are impacted by this enrollment process. And what families need, but especially Boston families, is a school enrollment system that features high quality schools across the board. And is easy to navigate in enrollment, and information about the schools is generally available. And what we've built is a system that's complex to navigate. Schools are of varying quality even within the same sector. And in addition to navigating processes and deadlines and trying to figure out the quality of schools, basic data on schools is really hard to find. We've had a lot of parents talk to us while we've built the site. We've been really lucky to work with a ton of parents and families and students and teachers in Boston. I encourage actually each of you after this webinar or right now to go to any Boston school, pick your school, the website, and try to figure out what time school starts in the morning, and whether that school requires a uniform or provides before after school programming for children, and at what cost. These are basic data points about the school that are really important to understand when a family is trying to figure out where they're going to send their children. And then go and try to figure out how that school is performing according to the academic metrics set by the state. And you're not allowed to use Boston School Finder. No Boston School Finder. So I've done this a lot. And this access to data is also a really strong point where equity, it's not equitable. A lot of families who have the means and who can sort of dig into data sets are able to navigate the system really well, but a lot of families who don't have that opportunity or don't have that clarity aren't able to navigate the system, and it puts them behind from the beginning. And so these are some of the reasons. I'm sorry, I totally lost my slide deck. And so these are the reasons we built Boston School Finder. We know that the site is not a cure-all, but I want to take you through some of the ways in which we're bringing an equity lens to developing this. Anyone can build a website, but we did a lot of research upfront before touching code. And so we really understand our customer and the challenges, and we built specifically for families who have the least resources. So we built a mobile first approach. Because we know that many of our families in Boston, their access to internet is via their phone. We leverage high quality translation because many of our families don't speak English at home. And our site is also ADA compliant, and we know that filter and search in a flexible way is really important. Um, the site itself is an, oh, I'm sorry. The site itself is an important tool, but we also communicate the information in various ways, and our tactics are geared towards providing our most high need families with the information they need. And so we send information through a variety of channels, our email newsletter, text alerts, key community partnerships, and our parent ambassadors who are on the ground. And we're also sector agnostic. We believe that there are great schools in every sector, in every type of school, and there are not great schools. And that school is a very personal decision for a family. And so we've built partnerships with DESE, BPS, Mass Charter Association, private schools, Metco, with the mission of simply getting information to families in hopes of helping to level the playing field. So thank you guys for listening. I'm looking forward to the questions and discussion. And we know that enrollment and registration in Boston is not right now an equitable process, and School Finder is a step towards that. But we also know that there needs to be implementation of research-based practices and policies to support all families to make large-scale change happen. So thank you very much.
Raina, thank you so much. So I want to kick it back to our panel and have a conversation here, and also give time for our listeners and participants here to enter questions into the chat, so we can have a lively discussion. I want to start with Raina, while you're fresh, Raina, here a little bit. So why do parents choose schools? Like, what are their top reasons for choosing a particular school?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think that a lot of families, and I would say that from the polling and research that we've done, it varies a lot based on that family's needs, and also like sort of where their child is. Some things are really constant across the board. Parents name safety as one of the top reasons why they choose a school. Academics and teacher quality are another one. Across the board, people believe that these things are important. But then it really varies, you know, and it depends on the family and, you know, who they are and where they live. As the family has younger kids, a lot of times closeness to home is really important, and sort of logistical things around, like, does the school have before care? Do they have after care? Things like that become really important. Whereas as students get older, those types of logistical things are less important. And I think, I think families are looking for fit. But I would say top reasons that we hear are definitely around safety and whether the school's academic profile is strong.
Great. So I'm wondering, I'm going to touch upon BPS's student assignment policy for a moment, and try to connect this over to Peter with his work around looking at segregation in our city, or further segregation in our city. So what we know is that some of our neighborhoods have, let me say it a different way. We know that families are given choices of, they can choose different schools in BPS, right? So they're typically given a choice of 6 schools. And they're given tier 1 schools, which are the sort of higher performing schools, if you will. And they're given at least 2 of those. And they're given then 4 other schools. Potentially, it could be more tier 1 schools, or it could be schools that are lesser performing academically. In some neighborhoods, there's very few. They may be given the choice to go to a couple of tier 1 schools, but the likelihood they'll ever get into those schools is incredibly low because there's very few seats available. So their schools in BPS are incredibly small. And so I just want to connect this back to Peter's point. What I see is potentially here is that parents may want to go to school close to home. They may want to go to their top performing school close to home, but too often they're sent to schools that may be their second, third choice because there's not enough access to high quality schools in different neighborhoods. So I want to first test that with you, Raina, to see if that is your experience and what you understand. And then I want to kick it over to Peter to just ask more about the research that you've done around segregation in schools, or increasing segregation, racial and economic segregation, and to just hear if you've done any of further looking at the student assignment policy in its effect on that.
Yeah, that's absolutely true, Ross. And I think that I believe it was actually BARI and BPS 2 years ago, I think, like put out a report reviewing the new home-based assignment policy that BPS uses. And they found exactly that, right? Geography matters a ton for school equity. Boston has an uneven dispersal of high-quality schools across the city. If you live in Charlestown or the North End, your chances of being placed in a level 1 school are very high. If you live in Mattapan, your chances are very, very slim. I think it's like 80% to 5% or less, or something like that is the number. I can't quite remember. But yes, that's absolutely true. And those neighborhoods are largely our Black and Latino students, and they attend lower quality students across the city. And so that's absolutely true.
Peter, did you guys look in this project around, because you had mentioned the student assignment policies and the shifts from 1980 to, I believe it was 2014, 2017. What impact does this have on equity, the student assignment policy on equity, and the impact on segregation in our city?
Oh, sure. Actually, one of the first things we did, and this didn't quite make it all the way into the paper, but we did take a look at the various different school assignment programs over the years since back to the 1960s. And what we saw is that when a student assignment program explicitly is designed to account for racial and ethnic disparities, it's actually pretty good at reducing segregation. It's pretty good at integration. The less you have a student assignment policy that is specifically designed to do that, the less integrated your schools will be. In around 2000, 2001, BPS dropped race as a consideration for school assignment. And in, I think it was 2013, 2014, the city implemented the home-based assignment program that focuses on getting kids into schools that are in their neighborhoods. And what we found is that, and what BARI in particular has found to the report that Raina mentioned, is that you end up concentrating schools and students in the neighborhoods and the silos in which they live. So you have students that may have broader access to I don't know, 10 schools, but none of them are the tier 1 schools that they really want to go to. And what we've actually found is that if that happens, those people who are able to leave the city do so. They take their kids and they go to your Brooklines. They take their kids and they go to Medford or Malden or Lexington, or they go elsewhere, but they don't stay here. That is the drop off in the middle income families that we've seen back in my slide deck. Those families who are able to leave and don't get into the schools that they want simply, to a certain extent, take their child elsewhere. And if we actually want to address that, we're going to have to come up with some sort of policy that is not just focused on school assignment, because there's only so far that can go, but actually address a lot of the inequities we see in housing policy in the state, in the city, and try to ameliorate that in some way.
So, okay, so Peter, you mentioned other cities and towns and this sort of exodus outside of Boston that we've been seeing for a number of years for middle income families. Ryan, I want to explore a little bit more of your research around this need blind distributions, right? So there's 14% need blind distributions. And of that, 2/3 of those need blind distributions are going to support wealthier, the top 20% of communities. I think I have these numbers right. I'm maybe not, but it's
perfect.
Okay, so what is going on here? Like why are there need blind distributions? What is those 14% of need blind distributions supposed to go towards? So number one, the first question is, why are they needs blinds? Are they supposed to go to support building new schools and facilities? And then can you elaborate on the kinds of things the need blind funds, so what are they supposed to be used for, and what are they used for?
Sure. Well, on the use side, they're general unrestricted aid to schools. These really make up the core of school district budgets. And it's the main state contribution to school budgets that's paired with whatever local contributions come in as well. So this money is used for staff salaries, buying equipment, purchase of technology, facilities plan in terms of maintenance and cleaning and all of that. It's not really, these needs line factors aren't necessarily earmarked for a particular purpose that the needs-based factors are. It all just goes into one big pot. Now, of course, there's other state line items that support school building and a variety of other things, but the aid we're talking about, of which these needs line factors are a part, is the general school aid. Now, to your question about, well, where did they come from? They've all evolved over the course of time based on meeting a certain need when it comes to making a state budget. We put in place the school funding system we have now in 1993, but there was a school funding system before that, and the situation wasn't just that everyone was wiped clean, and they ended up transitioning to a funding formula that was entirely based on student need. There needed to be some level of continuity from year to year, and a lot of these funding formula factors have basically that idea of continuity year to year, plus building in a small increase, such that everyone gets something a little bit more than last year as their base. But that's a fundamentally different logic than matching state resources to the level of student need and the number of students district by district.
So Ryan, you kind of, at the end of your presentation, you may have like a little bit alluded to, there may be some opportunity here. There may be an opportunity to provide more aid to districts in need at this time. Like, can you speak a little bit more about what you're talking about there?
Sure. What we found is essentially that there's within the budget, $778 million that are attributable to factors that aren't necessarily aligned with the project of the Student Opportunity Act. Now, they have good reasons, and I'm not saying zero them all out. But what you find is that in wealthy communities, they tend to spend much more than what's required anyways. In lower wealth communities, they tend to feel much more of a constraint, such that if they spend right at foundation budget. And so I don't have the numbers on the top of my head, but you'll notice a sort of a growth in that curve in terms of how much communities spend relative to what's required. Now, if wealthier communities are spending, already sort of have a revealed preference to spend more and the capacity to do so, it raises a question about, can state resources then at a moment of need be used to deploy to another purpose? Now, I don't want to come off as saying that we really need to take away from one community and put to another. It's a much more complicated process than that. But what it shows is that there may be, even in moments of constraint, some flex within the budget such that if the state revenue situation is such that they can't meet their or they feel they can't meet their Student Opportunity Act obligations to increase funding, it may not, the next step may not need to be an across-the-board cut, such that everyone gets, like they did in 2004, 20% cut out of their state aid, which ends up being regressive because lower wealth communities rely more on state aid. And so there may be a middle ground that should be explored if and when it becomes clear that the state's going to have trouble meeting its Student Opportunity Act. But first and foremost, we should focus on meeting the Student Opportunity Act obligations and countenance this only if and when.
Just on that, so are we meeting the obligation of Student Opportunity Act?
It remains to be seen. There's we would know when a budget is finalized, and the timeline for a budget is pretty unclear, just because the state revenue situation is in such flux. And so normally what would happen is by July 1st, the state would file its budget for the next year, and at that point, school districts would know what they're getting. At this point, we don't have a July 1st budget, that's clear. The state has level funded every school and municipality at what they were getting last year for July. What happens after July is not entirely clear. The governor indicated in some remarks yesterday that there should be we should have a better beat on that 30 days from now. But that really relies on two things that haven't happened yet. The first is that the July 15th tax deadline will come in and will come and go. And so we'll have a better picture of what state revenue will be. The second is that there may be continued or another round of federal action to provide federal support for municipalities and for school districts, as happened in the wake of the Great Recession, where the state relied on federal support to keep school district budgets flat for 3 years. And so if those things happen, we may know. But at the moment, it's going to have to take at least another month, Ross.
Great. Thank you, Ryan. Yeah, I mean, this is such a timely conversation around funding. I mean, we're hearing so much more about the concern around state and local funding, and especially around education. And the Commissioner of Education came out yesterday with a series of guidance around reopening of schools. You know, in the media, there's some expressed concern around how will districts meet those obligations. Essentially, you know, how will they redesign their buildings and be able to open appropriately? I think this is going to be, you know, this is just my commentary on this, but you're welcome to weigh in. But, you know, this is going to be really important to watch, to see what happens over the next few months and see which districts are able to prepare their schools safely and develop the confidence with families to open up, and which districts will not, and why not, and what will the impact of that be? You know, when potentially you see a major city not be able to reopen, but a number of communities around it be able to reopen, and will that have any impact on enrollment and you know, sort of parents choosing to move out of the city if they can, or whatever? I'm just sort of expressing my concern over the impact of finite resources that we're feeling for the first time in a long time, and a massive health crisis, to see how individual districts will be able to react. Actually, you're all welcome to weigh in on that, but I'm going to actually just give a very pointed question to Raina. Raina, what are you hearing from families about their concerns about reopening of school, if any? And do you see any equitable issues in what you're hearing? Meaning, you know, do you see differences in across racial, economic lines, across concern of trust in the school district about being able to hold school safely for their kids?
Yes, we definitely are. I mean, we're hearing from families. So the data is really stark, right? I encourage people to go and look at some of the things that, some of the data that's come out. The Globe has done a pretty good job of presenting some of this data, but our communities of color are the ones that have been struck the hardest by COVID, in Boston and elsewhere. And we are hearing concerns, and I think it was Mass Indicators a couple days ago, and this week certainly brought out some research, some polling that they did about the confidence that families have over reopening schools. It's definitely, there are disparities among racial and ethnic groups, which I think you would expect. And I think that is, it's pertinent to how much trust families have in the education system right now, and who trusts the educational system, and also the choices people had. Ross, you alluded to families being able to move out, move in. I think we are going to see that play out. We are seeing families who I think will make those choices to leave if they feel like if Boston is not a tenable situation for them, if they can. I do worry about a lot of the issues, you know, this becoming very much so like a equity issue if the, you know, sort of wealthier suburban districts, whiter school districts are able to open schools, and Boston or Chelsea or Everett are not. And I think that one of the challenges there is just, you know, the size of the district and the resources. I think it's kind of Ryan's presentation about how we resource the school communities, and sort of the ability of higher income communities to basically spend more, right? I think is really pertinent here. And so those are all things that we are hearing, we're seeing, and I think our families are incredibly concerned about. Everyone wants school to reopen. Like at the bottom line, like everyone wants to go back. But the confidence that people have, I think, in the safety of school right now is very different depending on the group you're in.
Well, I think that's really important to continue to watch. I have 3 kids in the Boston Public Schools, and I am dying for school to open again. but only when it's safe.
Yeah. And I'll
um,
just,
yeah, go ahead.
oh, sorry. I was just going to say too, is that I think that one thing that we're overlooking a little bit here is the just the engagement of families in this process. And I do wish that, like, obviously the state needs to put out the, you know, overarching specifications, but I think when you look at schools, like, who knows their families the best? The principals and the teachers. Who has their needs um, most at the forefront? Teachers, principals, leaders, right? And I do wish and hope that we'll start seeing some of that support moving, like, directly to schools too, and schools being able to make decisions based on the families and their staff and what they feel like they can do, because there are schools across Boston that have responded to this very well. And I think given a chance, now that alone is an equity issue, right? Like, we have 125 schools. Is it we open all of them or we open none of them, right? It's, you know, it's a tough call, but I do think that the people who are best positioned to engage families in this process, which is what really needs to happen to get to a solution, are the school leaders, the teachers, the staff at the schools, because they know their families the best.
Agreed.
Ross, if I
So
could
important.
just put a point on what Raina just said. One of the things we did over the course of remote learning was compile a database of the practices of the 20 largest school districts in Massachusetts relative to a variety of things that our scan of the literature and of what's happening elsewhere matters. And that allowed us to see how school district approaches evolved with state guidance. And it's true that the experience of students has been tremendously variable, even within school districts, but that at the level of the state and school district interface, that the guidance that the state put out really did guide school districts and help give them a way to move forward and you know, in some ways help them decide what to do. And so it's important that as we move forward with additional guidance, and of course there'll be several rounds, that be as informed by the students and the families who are impacted as it can be, precisely because it's taken seriously.
Sure. You know, we also, they're just in the comments here, we also just saw one of the comments come in saying, you know, what about those families of kids we haven't even heard from since March, who haven't engaged in online learning? I think this will be another part that we'll need to address when school resumes, is making sure we're accounting for all of our students, and we know that they're all safe and fully enrolled in school somewhere if they're not enrolled in our districts anymore. So I want to ask a slightly different question to over to Peter about this is more about using MECO and or interdistrict or cross district programs, sort of magnet school programs that are economically racially integrated. Have you guys looked at it all, Peter, around the impact of MECO or other programs, magnets type programs, on the segregation that's happening in schooling?
That's a tough question, Ross. We did
Sorry,
take
Peter.
Yeah, no worries. We did take a look at Metco, just in terms of, like, trying to understand how that program kind of works within the city and within the context of the cities that it works in. Essentially, 68% of Metco's 2018-2019 class were Black students, smaller proportion Latino. The schools or the program is good. It's a good, you know, it was introduced in 1964, I believe, to try to move students around, get them access to education they didn't have access to in the city. And it's a good program. The concern I think that I would have is the scale of the problem, and the scale of the situation in Boston is such that while Metco is good, and while kind of these inter-district exchanges are good and coming from a good place, they're not necessarily up to the scale of, you know, the Boston schools in 2019. They educated roughly 66,000 students. 2,000 students here, a couple thousand students there, moving them around to different schools outside of the city is great for those individual students and great for those individual student experience, but it's not necessarily addressing the segregation within Boston schools themselves. And as much as increasing funding for it, for METCO, and as much as getting more schools on board, I know there's still like limitations into what schools METCO is sending students to. There still are real challenges within the 66,000 or so students that are attending Boston schools here in the city of Boston. And that's, kind of what I would encourage people to focus on. And yeah.
Thank you, Peter. All right, so I have one last question. It's a wrap-up question for each of the panelists. There's been a new commission. This is all pretend, but let's pretend. There's been a new commission to solve inequity in the educational system in greater Boston area. And they're calling on you and they're saying, what should we do to make sure that we have a more equitable educational system in the greater Boston area? What advice would you give them? No particular order, you weigh in as you're ready.
I feel like I have to keep with my theory of the case is that it's difficult to address schooling without addressing housing. The more access to affordable income restricted and affordable middle income housing, and this is a concern for Boston, this is a concern for the region, the more equitable our school districts could very well become. So better housing for all income groups
Peter,
and all families.
You are nothing but if you are not consistent in your response. So thank you, Peter.
I do what I can.
Ryan or Raina, you guys want to jump in?
I think, let me set up Raina. I think the work that she does and the Peter does to get data in the hands of individuals who are impacted by policy is tremendously important work. And from the grassroots level, making sure that people are empowered is important. And if I'm allowed to just sort of blue sky this and propose something that would never happen, we have very small school districts in Massachusetts. We could bump the districts, the district borders out such that they're more homogeneous and more integrated, and that might do an awful lot of good.
Thank you, Ron. Let's do that. Raina.
That's a hard question, Ross. I think I think we often try to solve for, like, we create sort of technical solutions for these very like real problems that families are feeling. And I think that the technical solution is important, but we will never have like the answer, like for example, like the BPS assignment policy. As long as we have schools that are doing not, like some of them are doing really well and some of them are doing really poorly. And as long as we have that situation happening, it will be really hard to make it equitable because someone will always be left out, right? And so I would say that, like, we know through research and policy and other cities and what they've tried, like we know there can, and in Boston itself, like there can be great schools. There are great schools in Boston. There are wonderful schools in Boston and wonderful teachers and wonderful principals and leaders doing like amazing work every single day. And what are we not doing as policymakers or researchers in not bringing these practices to every single person across the city? Like we could make that happen. We could invest in teachers in a way that we aren't doing today. We could invest in school leaders in a way that we're not doing today. We could invest in parent engagement in a way that we're not doing today. And all of those things would help make these technical solutions work. And so that's what I would say. I would say, let's look at the best practices that are happening in our city today and try to bring them to every single school that is there.
That's awesome. Well, look, there could be no more important topic than equity in education in our city at this time and going forward. And so I am so happy that each of you guys is involved in studying that and solving for that. So thank you so much for being panelists today. And I guess I should turn it over back to Dan. Dan, thanks for hosting us.
Of course, and I've been kind of casting around for a wrap up, and Ross, I think you basically just captured everything that I want to say, and just the basic sense of there's nothing more important than this right now, right? And so much was just covered. This was such a fantastic panel. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you, Ross, for leading us through the wilds here. Just a great conversation, and just it's such a panorama of challenges and opportunities. And you know, I think one of the things that I really enjoyed about this conversation is, right, we got to be bold, and we got to think big, and we got to do stuff. And so I think that that's that's where what the future holds. And being that, Ross, to mirror your compliment to Peter, I will be completely on note as well. I think research and data and, you know, those sorts of tools and those insights will be invaluable in helping us figure out what those things are and whether they work, right? If you try something, you got to know if it worked. So with that, again, thank you, Ross. Thank you, Raina. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Ryan, for sharing your wonderful work. Really enjoyed it. I'm sure the attendees did as well. Just a reminder to everyone who would love to hang out and chat for a little while longer, we have the BARI happy hour after this at bit.ly/BARI happy. There is a password on that. It's BARI, capital BARI. Our security system is better than 1, 2, 3, 4, but not much. Again, we are taking a week off next week to celebrate July 4th. So happy July 4th to everyone, especially at this time when we've all, especially the parents in the crowd who have been working double, but also public officials who we know, whether you have kids or not, have been working constantly to keep things afloat. Hopefully people get a few days off next weekend. And we'll be back here in 2 weeks for a panel on traffic. So with that, a final thank you to our panel, and we will see you all soon.
Thank you.